So we use a hexagon to help visualize the different aspects of a socio-technical system. It's a model, it's a tool to help us think about it. And I'd appreciate if you could talk about the 6 different nodes on the hexagon that that help us visualize or think about a socio-technical system. So could we start with goals? Could you talk to me about what people mean when they say goals? Matt, could you start?
Sure, no problem. So obviously Professor Chris Clegg kind of propose this hexagon as a way of thinking about any socio-technical system and thinking about the different parts of the system which are involved. So goals in particular, and it will depend on what kind of system we're looking at, but that could be financial goals within organisations. It may be kind of personal goals that individuals might have within a system as well. So if we're thinking about a crowd event, it might be in terms of getting to the football stadium before the match kicks off. That might be one thing. It could be within a particular work group. It might be meeting a particular project goals. It might be time orientated. It could be quality goals. It might be in terms of numbers complaints. It could be in terms of other kind of particular technical specifications that people are looking to meet. We could look higher order in terms of its society levels. It might be in terms of, say, GDP or in terms of well-being, health outcomes, inequality, and so on. So it depends on what level our kind of system is. So whether it's a small group of people within a team, whether it's a whole organisation, whether it's a multi-team kind of system. So if you're thinking about a crowd event, and you could have supporters and police and stewards and so on, which might have different kind of goals we're all working towards. And it might be how, again, we could be talking about a whole society or city region or so on.
And it becomes quite interesting if you might find that sometimes there are multiple goals and that these are in conflict with each other at any one point, and that can be quite interesting to draw out through the research that you're doing or the work that you're doing. So for instance, it might be that somebody's personal goal is in direct conflict with their performance goal that the organisation set them, if it's to do with their job. Or it could be that you're designing a stadium that's designed to facilitate the crowd management, and it could be that individuals' personal goals are in conflict with the design goal that's been put.
And it's probably worth saying as well, some of these goals may be externally set, so it might be set by regulators, so maybe environmental legislation that limits what you can do or set specific guidance. And it might be even within an organisation, if a board has set particular goals around quality, time, cost, and so on, that actually for individuals within that system, it may well be they prioritise goals which are measured. So we often find that metrics drive, whether they're formal or not, what people focus on as goals as well.
I think that's a good transition to people. Obviously, people is another one of the nodes, and it's the people that decide these goals and values, things they prioritize. Can you talk a bit about people in the context of a hexagon?
Yeah, well, the people node is probably, I might argue, the biggest node. It covers a lot of ground. So the people might cover the people you've recruited, who needs to be in the position. The people might cover the training that people need, the responsibilities they have, the role requirements,
the backgrounds and interests and so on that people walk in with as well, and their attitudes and so on. So it's all of that individual level experience, drivers, motivation that people bring to the organisation or to the wider system. So again, it might be dependent on what level and where you draw that boundary for the system.
And it's quite important to draw that boundary within your system, because you can find that just becomes too big an area to cover.
That's really good. And we have culture as a different node. So can you differentiate a bit between people and culture?
So culture is shared. So it might be shared sets of values, expectations, or ways of doing things. So you often find culture is something that has grown up over time within a system. So again, you can think in terms of within an organisation, in terms of you might have different cultures between different departments. You might have an overarching culture, say, if you think about a tech firm, you might have a very different culture, expectations, norms, so what's acceptable, what kind of general practices are versus maybe an accounting firm or kind of a big consulting firm.
Yeah. So you talk about kind of a cultural level. You talk about the norms or the artifacts of the culture. So is it the norm that everyone comes into work late but then works late into the evening? Is it the norm that people sit at their desks even when the working day is finished because they don't want to be seen to leave?
And with safety, I guess, as well, is a key thing we find for a lot if you're looking at some of the analysis that we've done as a centre. So maybe in terms of the so you might have to be thinking about the rail industry and other kind of safety critical industries. There may be a very, very strong culture in terms of adhering to working practices in terms of collective responsibility for safety that you might not find in other contexts.
Yeah.
And it's probably just the last thing on this as well. So again, just thinking back to kind of multi-team kind of systems. So you might have very different cultures, say, between, again, going back to football grounds. So supporters going in, there might be a very clear kind of culture there in terms of what's acceptable in terms of behaviour, drinking, level of maybe banter or abuse, depending on how you term it, versus the emergency services versus ground stewards versus city council and others. And that can bring in conflicts, like Helen was saying, with the goals and so on as well.
Well, thank you. I want to pivot now and talk about technology, because it's socio-technical systems, and obviously technology is going to be a part of any technical system. Can you talk about technology?
So technology, so we can think about that. So they might encompass IT, which we probably think of straight away as technology. Also lower level kind of tools and equipment that we might be using. So it could be thinking in terms of within a workshop, it might be using a lathe or a piece of computer controlled kind of production machinery and so on. It might be automated, it might be under user control, it could be software as well that we're using. Thinking about how things are changing now, it might also be cloud computing, it could be machine learning. So it can be physical, low tech, and thinking back to the origins of socio-technical systems thinking from the mining industry and so on, quite low tech in lots of ways, but mechanization through to really high tech, but we can't see it, kind of cloud applications and machine learning and artificial intelligence and so on, anything in that spectrum.
Go on.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to add to that things that you might cover within that node. If you're trying to categorize things, you might you'd have the physical technologies themselves, but you'd also perhaps put under that category how often they're replaced, who's responsible for them. So anything related to the technology as well would probably fit there.
And what about infrastructure?
Infrastructure, yeah. So sometimes that categorization between technology and infrastructure can be a little bit blurred, but generally we'd talk about the larger scale and the physical in terms of work environment maybe, or in terms of buildings. It might be transport infrastructure. It might be the things that help enable the technologies or people, essentially.
And we've more recently, in some of the work I've been involved with, we've thought about this, we've called it like the soft infrastructure, but the business model that the organisation's using. So for instance, if you're using a piece of kit and you decide you're going to rent it as opposed to buy it, or you're going to have a particular service model attached to it, that impacts on the other harder infrastructures in terms of, do we need to store it? Do we need to have in-house employees, external employees?
It makes a lot of sense. You can start to think about things like supply chain. Yeah.
So those things I would call soft infrastructure, whereas you're talking, Matt, about some of the harder infrastructure as well, and the physical space and so on.
The last thing I want to throw out there just quickly is processes. Could you talk a bit about processes?
So this is the ways of doing things, essentially. So these may be formal or informal in some ways. So it could be in terms of the processes for using technologies or IT systems that have come through. It may be HR processes, practices, expected ways of working or achieving things. So within the workplace, that's quite easy, I think, to think about. But in terms of other kind of systems as well, it may be set ways of getting from A to B, navigating a building, kind of managing kind of other users or components within the system.
Yeah, and it can be quite useful if you're doing any, whether it's research, whether even any sort of consultancy in this. It can be quite useful to try and map that process, because the process that one person thinks they're using might be different to the process somebody else thinks they're using, and actually by drawing this out, you can present that back to people and try and sort of get them to reflect on whether that process has extra stages or...
That's a great point. I think the other thing I'd say on that as well is it's amazing, I think, looking at what the formal procedures quite often are and what the actual processes that people follow on the ground are, and how those adapt and grow over time to take account of the realities and the unexpected things that humans encounter quite often, and how those don't always match up with what is intended at the time of design, particularly around IT or formal working practices that managers might also kind of put in place.
And I think sometimes this can reflect, going back to one of the other nodes, the cultural side of things, can't it? That the culture that people work within can affect how those processes shape.
And the goals and the people and the expectations and the infrastructure in terms of what they're able to do and so on as well.
Thank you
it's
very much. It's a system. So a system, and just to summarize, comprised of goals, people, technology, processes, infrastructure, and culture. That, from what I got at the end, you're touching on the idea that it's all interrelated, and it's the risk that any change engineer, if we can call that, within any organization could do, is overemphasize any one node without properly reflecting on and understanding and exploring the potentially unintended or intended consequences throughout the system.